Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Louise Bedsworth. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We are a research center at the law school at Berkeley, where we're focused really on the implementation of climate and environmental solutions. We really do work to bridge the work that's happening on campus with policymakers, communities, and others to help advance practical and effective solutions. Our Lunch and Learn series, which is made possible through our partners, Wilson Sonsini, Oric, Hanson Bridget, and Water and Power Law Group, is a forum in which we like to share our research findings, but also host conversation about current and emerging policy topics. And really excited today to be joined by two of our faculty members, Sharon Jacobs and Dan Farber, to talk about the implications of the 2024 elections, both presidential and congressional elections, and what that could mean for climate and environmental policy. And so, of course, the 2024 elections, we've just got, I think, our final House result in yesterday for a final district here in California. But the result we saw, obviously, President Trump coming back into the White House and Republicans taking control of both the House and the Senate. And these election results come on top of what was a very active year in the courts that also have affected climate, environmental, and energy policy, including the rollback of the Chevron doctrine, but other court decisions that affect how process and authority of federal agencies. And of course, earlier this fall, we were joined by Dan and colleague Ken Alex to talk about Project 2025. So as we look at the outcomes of the 2024 elections, I think we're trying to explore what this could mean for energy and the environment. And so with Project 2025, we have an administration coming in that does have a very detailed playbook that we can look to see what may happen, that has a lot of implications for the administrative state, the ability of agencies and departments to implement policies, and with this sharp focus on many of the agencies that we look to, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Interior, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, that affect so many parts of our climate and energy policy. And if we look at the first Trump administration, we may have some foreshadowing of what is to come. One of President Trump's first actions was to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, and following that to revoke California's waiver for its ZEV program and greenhouse gas emission standards. So we definitely saw rollbacks occur during that first administration. However, I think looking where we are today, we are in a very different context as well, where we have businesses that have made significant progress and commitments to address energy and environmental issues. And in fact, heard the CEO of Exxon at the recent Conference of the Parties say he did not think that President Trump should withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. And we've heard the automakers asking the Trump administration not to roll back federal fuel economy standards. We also have states, in a reaction in the last administration, come together as the U.S. Climate Alliance, where we have nearly half of United States states committed to reaching carbon neutrality by the middle of the century. And then we have the market moving in the direction of clean energy, where we have wind and solar costs that are now competitive or lower than fossil fuels. Electric vehicle sales are set to have another record year. And on the less positive side, we're seeing increasing disasters, climate-related disasters, and that affecting availability of insurance and a number of other economic and social costs due to changing climate conditions. So we're in an interesting moment where I think we're seeing a lot of momentum to address energy and environment and climate issues, but also likely to be having an administration coming in that could be quite threatening to that progress. So I'm very happy that we have Sharon and Dan here today to help us talk through these issues. And so Sharon Jacobs is professor of law here at Berkeley, where she teaches in energy, environmental, and administrative law. She joined us a couple years ago after serving on the faculty at the University of Colorado School of Law. And then we are also joined by Dan Farber, who is the Shosedo Professor of Law here at Berkeley. And he is also the faculty advisor to CLE. And he is an expert on environmental law, administrative law, and constitutional law. So very excited to have both of you join us. I think we were going to have Sharon share some perspectives, followed by Dan. We will then open it up for questions from everybody here. So encourage you, if you have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as we can while we are all here. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Sharon.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks for that introduction. It's great to be here with you and with Dan to talk about what we can expect in 2025 for climate, energy, environmental policy. My plan is to focus my initial remarks on energy policy, although I'll leave the specifics of the Inflation Reduction Act to Dan. He's been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of writing on those issues, and maybe we can have a conversation about it in a few minutes. But I'm curious to find out today whether I'm going to be playing my usual role, which is the Cassandra to Dan's optimist. We had our Loper Bright webinar, and that seemed to be the role that I played. Similarly, when we talked about the major questions doctrine a couple of years ago. So we'll see what happens today. But I think a lot is going to change in energy policy. And of course, that has a direct impact on climate policy and climate goals. I think as what we're going to see at the outset, we've already seen is that the language around energy policy is changing. So, climate is out, climate change is out as language, the just transition is out, energy justice, I believe, will be out for the new administration. Right, not across the country, but in terms of the official policy that we see coming out of the White House and some executive branch agencies, and maybe out of Congress, economic growth will be in, national security will be in, all of the above will be in. That's a phrase I've heard an awful lot from some of the members of the Trump transition team and some of the new appointees to key posts in his administration. So, just because language changes doesn't mean policy changes, but I think we can expect to see policy change quite a bit as well. So this all of the above strategy, for example, means more energy production of all kinds. I think you've seen a lot of emphasis on that to meet rising demand. There's no question that energy demand is increasing after staying pretty flat for a long period of time. One of the key drivers of that increase, of course, are data centers. For artificial intelligence, there's some recent estimates to the extent that data centers could consume about 10% of United States electric generation by 2030. That's up from about 4% today. Now, we don't know if we're going to see kind of that level of increase in demand. Sometimes past estimates have been proven inflated in practice, but that's a pretty significant rise in electricity demand. We're also seeing rise in electricity demand, of course, from electrification efforts in buildings and cars, vehicles. But to meet that demand, I've heard a lot of incoming Trump administration officials and advisors say we're just going to have to build a lot of power plants, and they're sort of Catholic with a small c, right? And their understanding of what kinds of plants we're going to have to build, right? They're thinking about oil, not oil plants, but they're talking about coal plants, maybe gas plants, certainly fossil fuel plants. But also nuclear power plants, also geothermal power plants, also some of the renewable technologies like solar and wind that we've seen President Trump be a little bit more skeptical of. So I think we're going to see an effort to build a lot. And that's going to be an interesting process to manage because generation increases to meet this new demand might result in increases on customer bills. And we know from the 2024 election that consumer concerns about prices was a major driver of President Trump's electoral success and the electoral success of the Republican Party. So how that build out of new generation is going to affect customer bills and how consumers are going to react is sort of an unknown at this point. Another thing we know just kind of generally about the Trump administration, part two, is that there will be a new National Energy Council in the White House consisting of the relevant agency heads and led by Doug Burgum, who is President Trump's appointee or likely nominee to lead the Department of the Interior, governor of North Dakota. And as governor of North Dakota, he has a really interesting track record. So he has supervised, yes, a lot of fossil fuel development in the state, but also the siting of renewable generation. So I think he embodies this kind of all of the above strategy that we might see coming out of the White House. And the other sort of big overarching thing I wanted to say about energy policy is I think that permitting reform is going to be a big piece of this. That's an area where we've seen some bipartisan agreement in the last couple of years. The idea that our permitting for various forms of energy generation is too slow, too difficult, and has stood in the way not just of fossil fuel projects, but of renewable energy projects as well. So there has been some agreement across the aisle that we need to engage in permitting reform. We've seen some of that happen already, but there seems to be a desire to do more of that, potentially through the reconciliation process. I've heard some mention of the reconciliation process as a likely vehicle for permitting reform. I think that the Republicans have learned from the Inflation Reduction Act that a lot can be done via the reconciliation process. So stay tuned on that front. Just a few specifics to throw in there in terms of specific federal energy agencies and their activities. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is a quote unquote independent agency, which means it's led by a bipartisan commission of 5 who are not all, no more than 3 can be from the same political party. So there's sort of some built-in bipartisanship in its governance. Also, the heads are insulated from removal by the president, except for cause. So, a little bit more independence there, but the incoming president does get to appoint the chair of the commission, and the chair has quite a bit of power to set agendas and work with staff. So, at FERC, we will see a shift of the chairmanship from current chair Willie Phillips, and perhaps that chair position will go to Commissioner Christie or Commissioner C, the 2 Republican members of the commission. But the commission is still going to be 3-2 Democratic appointees to Republican appointees unless someone resigns. And that could be the commissioner, Willie Phillips. That has been the practice of chairs, but it didn't happen when Biden was elected. The sort of previous Republican appointed chair, Danley, stayed on. So why does this matter? Well, FERC is in charge of transmission policy at the federal level, along with the Department of Energy. They have a key role to play in transmission planning through regional markets and otherwise. And we need to build out our transmission grid, not only to meet the climate goals of the current administration, but also to meet the grid expansion goals of AI and other industries that the incoming administration appears to care about. And with some estimates, we need to grow our transmission system maybe by 60% by 2030. Maybe need to triple our transmission system capacity by 2050. That was to meet emissions goals. But a lot of that grid shoring up and building out will also meet, I think, some of the goals that are important to the incoming administration. So I think we're going to see continued progress on transmission. The grid might just look a little bit different than it would have if the priority were clean energy development. Although again, right, it's the regional markets, the RTOs and the ISOs that have a lot of say over which projects are proposed, and they have their own priorities. In terms of the Department of the Interior, I think the big issue to watch there is going to be offshore wind leasing. So the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management and Leasing, Trump hates offshore wind. And I've tried to sort of wrap my mind around why this is. He says it's because it can ruin the environment and kill birds and kill whales. Like, I would love to believe that that's the reason, because I love the idea of a President Trump who cares deeply about whales and other wildlife. His opposition seems to have started with opposition to a Scottish wind farm that disrupted the view from one of his golf courses. And he's also talked about property values, et cetera, but there's no question he's not keen on offshore wind. He can't end offshore wind leasing with the stroke of a pen, but he can, with the Department of the Interior, kind of slow walk permits. They can, as Dan will talk about, their incentives that may or may not be limited in the current federal government. Already, we've seen in New York a wind project pause in anticipation perhaps of the changed regulatory environment. In California, we're betting big on offshore wind, right? We've got 5 leases already signed offshore. The state has spent, $100 million, more than $100 million already to support offshore wind infrastructure. We have a framework for procurement of up to 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind through the California Department of Water Resources. So, it matters a lot to California and our plans, what happens in terms of federal permitting on offshore wind. And then the final thing I'll just say quickly is that we have an incoming head potentially, right, as long as he gets Senate approval, at the Department of Energy, Chris Wright, who is been in the industry for a long time, the energy industry, the oil and gas industry in particular. Currently has a company that supports services for that industry, but is a really interesting person because he also is an investor in Fervo, which is a geothermal energy company that uses enhanced recovery techniques. He's a board member of a small modular nuclear energy company. So it'll be interesting to see what his vision is for energy policy. The Department of Energy has an interesting portfolio, right? They have a big role in America's nuclear arsenal, but they also play a role in setting energy efficiency standards. They play a role in a lot of planning and also, of course, in handing out the funding that under the Inflation Reduction Act and other statutes. So they also play a role in liquid natural gas exports. So if anyone's curious about that, that's an area that we can get into a little bit later. And then very finally, on nuclear power, right? Again, an independent federal agency dealing with nuclear power, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But we've seen a lot of bipartisan interest in that issue. So that may be a place where we can still make progress on low carbon or zero carbon technologies. And maybe I'll end it there and look forward to hearing from Dan into our conversation.
Okay, great. I don't disagree with any of that. And it's not as pessimistic as I thought you might be. So I guess that's my optimistic side. I view being less pessimistic.
I'm trying to change.
Right. Anyway, so I'm not going to talk about those issues directly. I want to focus on a few other things. I want to talk about EPA and EPA climate regulations, and I want to talk about Biden's signature climate law, which Sharon already mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act. I want to say something about the impact on California, and then I want to talk about the prospects for beating Trump in court on various actions. So let me start with EPA. We know EPA will be battered. I've already heard talk about people leaving the agency because they think it's just going to be an awful place. We also can be pretty sure we'll have rollback after rollback. That's what we saw in the first term. Could be some variations this time. Maybe Musk will try to protect some of the stuff relating to electric vehicles. On the one hand, maybe, they won't be quite so negative on a few other points, but, I think everything that we know about Trump says that he really just hates environmental regulations generally. And so I think we can expect to see like an onslaught there. However, that's going to take time. He's going to, he's likely to issue an executive order saying these regulations should be repealed, and then, he'll say job done. But actually repealing the regulations is a very slow process. It follows the same procedure that the agency has to use to adopt the regulation in the first place. And so that's inherently slow. It took the Biden people a long time to get around to repealing and replacing a lot of what Trump did. It may go even slower if they disrupt EPA. There's been talk about things like moving EPA headquarters to the middle of nowhere, or cutting their budget by a third or a half or something like that. I'm not sure either of those will come to pass, but to the extent that they really mess up the internal workings of EPA, it will probably just take longer to do the rollbacks. I wanted to say something about the IRA. The IRA is a hugely complicated law. There's a lot of money there and it goes in a lot of different directions. It devoted at least $369 billion to clean energy. A lot of people think it's going to be higher because the tax credits aren't capped and there's going to be a lot of demand to use them. Trump says he'll repeal it. He's referred to it as, I don't know, the socialist scam Green Deal or something like that. But like almost everybody else who's talked about this, I think complete repeal is very unlikely. There have been billions of dollars of investments and many more planned projects in red states and Republican congressional districts. There's already been pushback from House Republicans about the idea of repealing. So I think what we're going to see is a more focused effort. I would guess that the most vulnerable thing, because it's unpopular with Republicans in particular, are the tax credits for EV purchasers. I think those have been seen as elitist because EVs are more expensive. And unfortunately, Teslas don't qualify for the tax credit, so Musk hates it too. But the GOP is going to be hunting around to offset some really big tax cuts that they have in mind. And so hard to know exactly where they'll land on all this, but I think at least the sort of most important areas of IRA tax credits and spending are likely to be maybe modified, but not devastated. I'll talk about that some more in the Q&A. For California, the biggest worry is what happens to California's car waiver. So I need to explain that for those of you who aren't, deep into this stuff. The Clean Air Act requires EPA to set standards for pollution from new cars, and in general, it forbids states from doing the same thing. There's an exception that only applies to California, but taking advantage of that exception requires EPA approval. If California does get the exception, other states are allowed to copycat and really just sort of, word for word follow whatever California is doing if they want to. Transportation is now the biggest source of CO2 emissions in the US. It's overtaken power plants. And it's crucial to California's climate plans and those in a lot of other places like New York. So this is really a critical issue. Trump seems almost certain to revoke the waiver. Certainly talked about it. There's some uncertainty. Musk might see it as being in his interest to keep the waiver. The car industry would like to keep the waiver, I think. But still, I'm not sure that's going to be enough to stop Trump. I think California has a good chance of overturning the waiver in court, but I'll put off that discussion for later. I'm not going to really say anything about the power sector because Sharon covered that so well. One final thing, and maybe this is the optimist in me, is what can we expect from litigation? In his first term, Trump had a terrible litigation record. Trump, his agencies, not Trump personally, a terrible litigation record, well below his predecessors, and in fact below Biden's, who followed him. Part of that was just due to sloppiness, to writing regulations that tried to go too far, failing to muster the evidence, failing to make really cogent legal arguments. You would think that would change. They might have learned their lesson. I'm not convinced of that. I don't see much sign that Trump has learned to value expertise and experience. Not if you look at the people he's appointing to the cabinet in many areas, including the EPA head who really has no significant previous contact with environmental issues. Now, of course, he had 4 years to appoint judges, and he'll get to appoint some more this time. And that, of favors him, obviously. But in his first term, he actually managed to lose the majority of cases, even where he had appointed the judge. So I'm not sure that'll help him for sure, but the question is how much. My prediction, I hate to make firm predictions because obviously, you know, it exposes you to the risk of just being wrong and looking kind of dumb in retrospect. But I do think he'll win less than half of the cases brought to challenge agency actions. And depending on how things play out, maybe a lot less than half. So I think California is considering investing money in the state attorney general's office to help the AG bring cases. That looks to me like a good investment. I think that the prospects for litigation, even given the more conservative judiciary, are still quite good. So a couple of words in closing. It's really going to be an ugly 4 years. You know, there's going to be continual attacks on clean energy, on environmental regulation of a variety of kinds, continual efforts to kind of promote and elevate the use of fossil fuels. Like I said, it's going to be really bad. And there's going to be, you know, another 4 years where every day you look at the news and there's something there, you know, that kind of hits you in the gut. We're going to lose ground, and precious time for reducing carbon emissions is going to slip away for 4 years. But as Louise was indicating, I think there are real limits on what Trump can do. I think the tide has shifted in favor of clean energy. And, you know, King Canute tried to order the tide to reverse itself and go out. He didn't have any luck. Ultimately, I don't think Trump will either. So thanks. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you both so much. That was terrific. And I think overall, not overly pessimistic. So I think that was nice. Well done. I know we have a few questions coming in, and maybe I'll start with one that we got early on. And Dan, you spoke to this a bit around the provisions of the IRA. And I guess this also touches on, Sharon, some what you talked about, given the economic job gains, you know, and the benefits of the IRA, might there be enough support around repurposed energy projects, such as, you know, transitioning brownfields to green energy facilities, to sort of protect some of the provisions of the IRA?
I think absolutely there will be enough support to protect some of the provisions. I think, you know, there are these multi-billion-dollar EV car factories being built, or some of them may turn out to be plug-in hybrid factories in, you know, places like Tennessee and Georgia and, you know, other very Republican states, and in some swing states like Pennsylvania. There are the production credits for renewable energy. Those, I think, could get tweaked, but there are very powerful economic interests behind those, including in a number of red states. Don't forget, Texas is the largest producer of wind and the second largest solar state in the country. And, you know, there are going to be representatives from Texas who are going to care about repealing those credits. And then there are also some things the oil industry likes. In particular, credits for carbon capture and sequestration. And, you know, I think they're going to push back against repeal. So I'm sure there will be, you know, some dents and, you know, and they could be worse than I'm expecting. But I do think that the IRA had enough time to really take root in a way that makes it very difficult to yank out.
One other question, and then I'll turn to some of the others that I wanted to ask, just specifically related to with IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, was the Justice 40 provisions that were that President Biden included, that 40% of infrastructure investments would benefit low-income disadvantaged communities. For the investments that are in place and the grants and the money that has gone out the door, do you see a pathway to preserving those Justice 40 environmental justice components, or how do you see that faring over the next 4 years?
Well, I'd be pretty worried about those. I can see the Trump administration maybe wanting to put an emphasis on rural areas because that's a big source of support. I can't see them caring about environmental justice, which I think Trump would just view as part of what he views as the DEI woke philosophy. And I think most of what, or all of what Biden has tried to do in terms of environmental justice is probably just going to get yanked. It's just something Republicans had never liked. I could be wrong. Maybe I will, I'd love to be wrong about that. But that's one where I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that at all, Dan. I mean, I think that for any money that's actually been committed and where the expenditures have been structured in a particular way, it's going to be very hard to walk that back. But I think in terms of the overall plans for Justice 40, I mean, that is basically an executive branch initiative, right? It's really 2 executive orders that are on this topic. It's a series of actions that have been taken within federal agencies, but not kind of at the behest of Congress, or not kind of obviously at the behest of Congress. And so that is sort of a day one possible walk back. I think we're going to know a lot on, the first day or in the first week of the presidency. I think he'll repeal those executive orders on environmental justice. I think he'll direct agencies and maybe a new executive order to kind of eliminate any programs they have that say environmental justice, right, or that are designed to support environmental justice initiatives. Like one example is FERC's Office of Public Participation, which does actually have a statutory basis. So there, I think the office itself might survive, but the kind of work that the office is doing, kind of emphasis on affirmative outreach to communities that we might think of as environmental justice communities, historically burdened communities, I think we can expect that to come to a halt.
Well, so maybe we'll turn now to we have quite a few questions that have come in, so I'll just start at the top here, which is, how do you foresee the Department of Government Efficiency, which Trump has announced Elon Musk will be one of the co-heads of, how do you expect that will affect climate policy and government oversight?
This is such an interesting, I mean that as an academic, it's such an interesting initiative. I mean, first of all, calling it a Department of Government Efficiency, it is no such thing, right? It is not a department of the government. It has not been created by Congress. It is not even a new office in the executive branch. It's sort of a department in name only. But we have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, 2 kind of outspoken critics of government regulation, who are going to be heading it. And what they've said they want to do is to go after federal regulations they find are overly burdensome. Unclear how exactly they do that, right? They've been pretty clear that they themselves should be seen as kind of outside volunteers, not even as a federal advisory committee. It remains to be seen whether the courts share that view, if the structure of this department is challenged. But they've talked about the court's opinion in West Virginia versus EPA, the major questions doctrine. They've talked about Loper Bright, which repealed Chevron, as giving them impetus to at least identify, maybe is the plan, right? Rules and regulations on the books that they think are ripe for rollbacks, but see Dan's comments on, how difficult it is to actually accomplish that rollback. But they've also talked about things like staffing cuts, right? We know that the Trump administration is eager to use the tool they used in the first administration at the very end, Schedule F, right, to reclassify federal employees in a way that would remove protections from a large number, job protections from a large number of those employees, and then reduce the size of federal agencies. We know that they're interested in the Impoundment Control Act, which is a piece of legislation that Congress passed to stop the president from just moving money around within the executive branch after Congress had appropriated it. They have suggested that act is unconstitutional, and that the president and the executive branch should just kind of stop funding certain programs, impound those funds, and then fight this out in the courts. See Dan's comments on the federal judiciary, right? But they also think there's a lot of money that can be moved around, even consistent with the Impoundment Control Act, and they want to do things like fixing the procurement process. So I think there's actually a lot of damage, not that they can do directly, but if they're successful in advising the government, and the executive branch sort of implement some of the policies that they're proposing, I think that that could have a pretty serious impact on agencies and their ability, as Dan mentioned, to roll back regulations and accomplish deregulation, but certainly also to kind of maintain the functioning of the regulatory agencies in a way that allows for continued enforcement, updating, implementation of the laws and regulations that we already have on the book. So I think there's a fair amount of damage that could be done there.
Yeah, I'm quite concerned about, not so much about this particular effort. I really like Department of Name Only, or DINO. I hope that catches on.
That's good.
I did look up, I was trying to figure out how to pronounce DOGE, and but it turns out nobody really knows. It's a crypto coin, but even used in that, there are like 3 maybe different pronunciations. So that just says something about the weirdness of this whole effort. And apparently they're going to use some kind of computer thing. So I don't know if it's going to, maybe they're just going to ask ChatGPT, give me a list of wasteful government programs, or maybe it's going to be more sophisticated. But I do worry that all these various actions, the Schedule F, the impoundment, whatever comes out of the Musk initiative, is going to end up doing real damage to federal agencies, to their expertise, to their ability to really, perform the jobs that Congress has given them. And that could be one of the, serious long-lasting effects of this administration. So now I'm being the pessimist.
Maybe we've just switched identities.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this will give either of you an opportunity to be an optimist, but how vulnerable do you think major pieces of congressional legislation like NEPA or the National Historic Preservation Act are in the forthcoming administration?
Maybe I can say something because it also relates to permitting reform. So one of our colleagues, John Gould, is an expert on the reconciliation process and the limits on the process. And I've had some conversations with him about this. And he's pretty skeptical that they can do a number of the things they're talking about through reconciliation, because reconciliation is supposed to be about fiscal results. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's essentially all about money. And it's hard to see how you can change NEPA and picture that as just a sort of primarily financial measure that happens to have some effect on policy. And the same thing with permitting. Maybe they'll make an argument that they'll get more federal revenue if they can permit things faster or something. But I think it's pretty doubtful they can do that. And if they can't do reconciliation, then they're going to have to go bipartisan in order to get it through the Senate, and maybe even in order to get some stuff through the House. One thing we haven't really talked about is they've got a very narrow majority in the House, smaller than it was last time, and they were almost unable to function in the last Congress. So I think maybe Trump will be able to galvanize them into pulling together, but it's a very disjointed group of people many of whom have, are really antagonistic toward each other within the Republican caucus. And I think getting everybody on the same page is maybe more difficult than they're imagining right now, even for reconciliation. see, I'm being optimistic.
Yeah, and the NEPA question is interesting because there was this kind of rogue case out of the DC Circuit in the last several weeks called Marin Audubon, and I'd be curious to hear Dan's thoughts on this. But a 3-judge panel of the DC Circuit essentially decided that there was no rulemaking authority for the Council on Environmental Quality under NEPA, which means that these new NEPA rules that the CEQ finalized kind of just in advance of the potential period during which rules become vulnerable under the Congressional Review Act, their status is a little bit in question. And I actually think that because of questions about the status of those NEPA rules, it becomes, as long as that can be exploited, it becomes less appealing to try to actually change the structure of NEPA as a statute if the executive branch has a little bit more authority to change policy quickly in terms of NEPA implementation. But I'd be curious to hear Dan's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't view that ruling as something that the Trump administration should feel good about, because they've also eliminated their own authority or it would have the effect of making it kind of pointless for Trump's CEQ to change the regulations back again. And it's going to make it much more difficult to coordinate between agencies. And finally, we have no idea what it might do in the courts, right?
Yeah.
If the courts are suddenly now, trying to figure out what to do without regulations they've relied on for years and years in some cases, I think it's only going to make permitting harder rather than easier. I'm sure they'll try just claiming that it wipes the slate clean and that NEPA doesn't really have to mean much anymore, but I'm just not sure that they're going to get a lot of traction for that in the courts.
Going to make for some interesting lawsuits over the next few years, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm also not sure the DC Circuit decision is going to hold up. It was a 2-1 decision. There's been a request for in-bank. I think it's debatable. I think if you had asked me in 1978 when they first issued the regulations whether they were legally binding, I'm not sure what I would have answered. But it's not 1978 anymore.
It's true, although we've seen
really disruptive change.
The way the Supreme Court feels about precedent.
Yeah, true.
Well, another question that you all are both very well positioned to answer, which is how does the Supreme Court decision on the Chevron doctrine make it more difficult or easier to defend environmental laws that Trump or his appointees might try to unravel?
Yeah,
I'm waiting to see if Sharon wanted to jump
in. Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think, and we probably agree on most of this, I do think that the sort of silver lining for those who want to defend kind of existing environmental protections of the Loper-Bright decision is that when agencies don't get deference or don't get Chevron style deference for their interpretations of law, that applies equally to deregulatory agencies and regulatory agencies. So that means, Trump administration agencies that are trying to adopt relatively narrow interpretations of statutes, that are trying to argue that the statute kind of literally doesn't support some of the existing regulations that we have on the books, like they're not going to get deference for those interpretations. So that, I think, makes the deregulatory project more difficult in the courts. On the other hand, right, regardless of who's in the White House, I think that Loper unleashed potentially a large volume. We'll have to see if this bears out empirically, but potentially a large volume of lawsuits challenging existing regulations, sort of coupled with the corner post decision that extended the major default statute of limitations for facial challenges to regulations. I think we're going to be seeing an awful lot of challenges to regulations and to the agency's interpretation of their key statutes I think that those could be quite damaging, in part because if they're brought strategically in, the Fifth Circuit or other circuits that have taken a pretty narrow view of administrative discretion and authority, we could get some pretty narrow readings of key statutes that we've sort of taken for granted for a long time, provide lots of leeway for agencies to protect the environment, regulate emissions, et cetera. And some of those might get reversed on appeal, others might not, and the courts really have a chance to write on not a blank slate, but they're going to be giving their best interpretation of the statute for the first time, and those are not then going to be as easy to shift in future administrations. You can't just have another administration come in that's pro-regulatory, interpret the statute kind of the other way, and get deference for that interpretation. So I'm worried about some of these lawsuits creating sticky precedent in the courts on the interpretation of statutes.
Yeah, I agree with that, although it's not really a function of Trump, right?
Right,
Those
right. That is sort of
lawsuits would be
independent
brought-
of Trump.
That's the Supreme Court's fault, not Trump's. And I think we'll have to wait and see how big of a problem that is, and how eager courts are to revisit all these issues. But certainly not helpful. But in terms of Trump's deregulatory efforts, it's certainly not helpful to him that Chevron was overruled. If you're in the White House, you love Chevron is your friend. And of course, if you're out of power, you don't like Chevron. But right now they're in power.
So I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have come in around sort of waiver issues. And so one is really, and I'll reinterpret it a little bit in terms of, I think there's sort of a couple pieces on the waiver revoking of the waiver that could, which we've seen in the past where a waiver is revoked under a Republican administration, such as when George W. Bush did it. Then we had Obama come in and reinstate the waiver for the greenhouse gas standard. So we've seen a swinging back and forth. So how likely do you think that is a pathway that we would follow? And then I guess, do you foresee a more permanent revoking of California's authority to set its own standards, which I believe would take an act of Congress? And so which of those two paths do you think we'll see? And how, I think that first is probably quite likely that we would see a waiver revoked via the EPA process. What about the process of sort of a congressional action that could limit California's authority?
In terms of the sort of denial of the waiver and then maybe having that reversed, I think it's certainly a possibility. There is a case that challenges the constitutionality of the waiver, at least for greenhouse gases, on the theory that I think somebody read the Declaration of Independence and thought it said all states are created equal. But there is some Supreme Court case law that suggests that there's some kind of equality interest between states. And the argument is that this unfairly favors California. The DC Circuit just rejected that. And I'm guessing it's not going to go anywhere in the Supreme Court either. A second argument is about whether the Clean Air Act allows California to get a waiver for greenhouse gases specifically. The theory being that California is not in a unique position to have climate change hurts everybody. For a variety of reasons, I don't think that's a very good argument. That doesn't mean that the Supreme Court might not go for it, but I think there are a lot of problems with that argument. And then the final argument is that the California waiver violates an entirely different statute, the one that gives the Department of Transportation the power to do fuel efficiency standards, and which states are absolutely not allowed to do. So the idea is anything you do to reduce emissions from vehicles is basically going to mean burning less gasoline or diesel, and that's entirely a federal decision. That seems somewhat in conflict with the Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts versus EPA, which draw a pretty sharp line between the fuel efficiency stuff and the tailpipe emission stuff. not inconceivable that the Supreme Court might go for it, but I'm kind of doubtful. I should also add, there's also an argument that you can't retract the waiver once you've given it, based on the fact that the statute doesn't say anything authorizing EPA to retract the waiver. And that's hotly disputed. I don't know how strong that one would be. And none of this stuff has ever gotten litigated all the way through, right? So we have a couple of district court opinions, but we don't really know exactly how the higher courts would rule.
It's really interesting to me, and sort of maybe as a transition a little bit to talking about California, but it's really interesting to me that for President Trump and sort of the people around him who've been talking quite a bit about the importance of state rights in the context of Dobbs and other issues, that when it comes to climate policy, that doesn't appear to be the approach. And Dan mentioned the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which has been proposed that it preempts sort of California's ability to set tailpipe standards for greenhouse gases. That's a statute that has also been used to shut down Berkeley's efforts, the city of Berkeley's efforts to ban natural gas infrastructure in new construction, right? And a very, I think, dubious interpretation of that statute by a panel of the Ninth Circuit in a denial of rehearing en banc, kind of interpreted that statute pretty broadly and interpreted what the state was doing in a very fluid way to find that statute actually prevented California and localities in California from prohibiting sort of this natural gas infrastructure. So this is, again, not necessarily Trump specific, but these challenges were taking place anyway. But I do think that we're going to see kind of renewed efforts to use federal statutes to preempt state action in these areas and other areas.
Yeah, I agree with Sharon about that. I think we've already started to see that even under Biden. That'll be interesting in the Supreme Court, though, because the preemption and Commerce Clause cases, which are another way of trying to limit what states are doing, can produce some very odd alignments in the Supreme Court because they're cross-cutting things, right? The liberals on the court tend to be in favor of national action, but they're also in favor of a lot of kinds of regulation, including the environment. And with conservatives, it's sort of the opposite, right? They favor the states, although they don't like these regulations. And so you just get these weird alignments where it's like Justice Thomas plus the liberals or something like that, or even the liberals are split, the conservatives are split.
That's a good point, actually. I mean, in support of that, there's the Virginia uranium case decided a couple of years ago where Justice Gorsuch, kind of came out very strongly in his opinion in favor of Virginia's ability to enact a moratorium on uranium mining. And in part, right, it was a kind of strong emphasis on the presumption against preemption and state rights and state authority, and kind of little patience for this sort of manipulation of the purpose behind local laws to really be getting at something else. So who knows?
Yeah.
A question for you, Sharon, which is if you could say a little bit more about the current status and future of LNG exports under the Biden and then to the Trump administration.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is an issue that has kind of come out of nowhere with the rise of hydraulic fracturing, which is, pretty recent when you think about the span of energy policy in the United States. But we used to have these, giant import terminals for liquid natural gas because we needed to import our gas. We weren't producing enough of it ourselves. And now, with the hydraulic fracturing, we're a net exporter of natural gas. And so a lot of these terminals have been converted to export terminals for liquefied natural gas. The Biden administration put a pause on approving export terminals for liquefied natural gas. That's something the Department of Energy does, approving the actual export of the gas. FERC has to approve the construction of the actual terminal, but sort of put a pause on it and said they were rethinking a kind of a decades-long memorandum and policy about whether it was in the public interest, which is the statutory standard to allow for the export of this gas. So, that pause was successfully challenged in court, which meant that the Biden administration had to restart the processing of these permits. And they have done, but they're doing it very slowly. They are going to come out with the Department of Energy has promised to come out with the revised memorandum on kind of whether or not this behavior is in the public interest by the end of this year. I haven't checked my email on the last day, but they want to get that out the door, because that will be the result of kind of a very careful process within the agency to decide whether exporting LNG is actually in the economic interest of the United States and of United States consumers and ratepayers, or whether that's going to lead to, say, a price spike in domestic natural gas. I'm sure the report will also say something about the carbon emissions associated with natural gas, but the Trump administration has been pretty clear that they are going to be full speed ahead on processing of permits for liquefied natural gas.
Great. I know we're reaching the end of the hour and we do have a hard stop at 1. So I want to ask one final question that draws from a few that have come in, but also relates to California has had a special session of the legislature to sort of beef up resources to be ready to respond to threats from the Trump administration. Obviously, other organizations are thinking about how they can react. What do you see as the most important thing that California can be doing and other organizations to protect progress and try to prevent rollbacks to some of these climate and environmental issues?
Well, I can start off and give Dan the last word. I mean, I think something Dan mentioned earlier, right, which is this increase in funding kind of across the board for our Attorney General's office, which was instrumental in kind of leading some of these challenges to Trump administration policies in the last term, is important. I've heard numbers like $25 million kind of bandied around, not just to sort of fight new federal initiatives, but to protect California's progress on climate and energy. And that takes manpower. And, we are, an extremely large state. We have a lot of resources compared to other states that are going to be working on these issues. So we have a real leadership role and an opportunity, I think, to use our resources in this way to sort of fight some of the rollbacks and defend the work that we've done. I also think, that I saw a question in the chat, so I just wanted to mention briefly, like, new regulation and new legislation in the state to kind of backfill in some of the areas where we might see the federal government pull back. Someone asked about species, for example. So, protections for endangered species. If the federal government kind of stops its forward motion on that, maybe pulls back enforcement, California can step up and make sure that we have protections under state law for all federally listed species. For example, there was a lot of that effect that failed to pass in 2017. So I think we can do a lot there as well in terms of backfilling gaps in the federal system.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I guess the only thing I would say is we've been talking about fighting off Trump, which I think is, and filling gaps, which I think is super important. But we also, I think, can't lose sight of our own climate goals. And I think, especially at a time when the federal government is missing in action, it's going to be really crucial for California to figure out ways to make sure that we hit our targets, that we're cutting emissions and sort of showing the flag, showing the rest of the country how it can be done at a time when otherwise we're really just talking about playing defense. So I think switching metaphors, I think it's really important for us to keep that beacon of hope alive.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. We're right at the end of the hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I have copied them all into a document though, and I will pass them along. Certainly pay attention on Legal Planet and other venues where I'm sure you'll hear more from both Dan and Sharon. And we will continue working on, of course, all of these issues and tracking what's happening at CLE. So thank you all so much for joining us. And Dan and Sharon, thank you again for taking the time and sharing your expertise and experience. We really appreciate it.